What's up, everybody? Peter X. Coffee here, and welcome to another episode of the Classic Rock Podcast. It's been a minute since I've done an episode. Today, we're going to look at the unique relationship that classic rock has with live albums. Now, other genres do live albums, their acts do live albums, but there's a special relationship, and the live album seems to be just more important to classic rock. And it's the only genre where certain acts have broken out via live albums. Let's see. So the first live album to really in the 50s, they didn't even bother with live albums. Who wants a live album? Yada yada yada. Well, James Brown in 1963 released Live at the Apollo. He did that with his own money because the record company was like, yeah, nobody wants a live album, even though James had a reputation for being a great live act. Well, he, recorded it, went in the studio and did, paid for everything and put it out there. And it did very well, and, got rave reviews. It did very well in the charts. And lo and behold, there was a market out there. Now, interestingly enough, it really wasn't followed up that much after that. I mean, the Rolling Stones got Live If You Wanted, I believe, in 1965. The Beatles, their live stuff was not released until much later, at least the late 70s into the 80s. I'm trying to think. The Monterey Pop Festival, where, the debut of The Who and Jimi Hendrix, that was 67. Took a couple years for that to be released. Even Woodstock, from 68, 69, took a couple years for it to be released. So, all those are classics now. But, so the concept of the live album had a kind of a slow start. Live albums really took off in the 70s. The first one that really took off was Peter Frampton, Frampton Comes Alive, I believe was 75 or 76. And that went diamond. It sold 10 million plus. It was a double album. It made a lot of money off that album. The same year, 75, Kiss Alive goes and Kiss breaks out off of that live album. Those they come out roughly at the same time. And then, the other act who, broke through on the live album was Cheap Trick Live at Budakon. And that was 77 or 78 when they broke out on that. There aren't any other genres you have acts, breaking out, going from obscurity to, mainstream success based on live albums. So that's why I think there is sort of a special relationship with classic rock and live albums. Now in the 70s, I mean, P-Funk, excellent live album, the P-Funk Earth Tour. James Brown did a few more live albums in the 70s and beyond. And particularly the 70s live albums were very good. Even better than 63 Live at the Apollo, because they were when James had his funk superpowers. Let's see, I think I said Earth, Wind, and Fire. I think Marvin Gaye did a pretty nice live album back, and this, I believe, centered in L.A., in the late 70s. Yeah, these are good live albums, but they don't sell and they don't have the impact. And these artists had already, broke big when they released their live albums. So again, yeah, it is a uniquely classic rock, where you really, really blow up. One of the reasons why I think, classic rock in the 70s and the live album was so big because there was a lot of money to be made, back in, on live albums in the 70s. Back, this model still works, but the models, the payment model for music, but it's messed up because of streaming. But, the long term model has been, you know, let's see, radio play, 50, split evenly between the writers and the record company. So the record company got half, and then the writer, the lyricist, got 25%, and the composer got 25%. Yeah, I mean, you did pretty good on that. For the most part, in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, the record company made most of the money off of the records. You got points if you're the band, but you know, the bands in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, most of their money came from touring. And as long as you had a manager, a touring manager and or slash and the manager that wouldn't rip you off, you did very well in the 70s because there was a lot of money, even though, tickets were going for 5, 10, 15, 20 bucks. They were, in the 70s, in the 60s, they're playing, 6 to 10,000 seat venues. You know what I mean? They're, the big acts, Zeppelin and the Stones, they're playing NBA arenas in the 70s. There's 18 to 20,000. They're playing big festivals to, 70,000 plus. And then, by the early 80s, I mean, the Stones are playing NFL stadiums. So, there was a lot of money to be made there. And, so there was an incentive to put a live album out there and to push the live album. Black music was very different in the 70s because, black acts were coming off the Chitlin circuit in the 50s and 60s, and that was essentially a club circuit, and some of them weren't even clubs. They were, I mean, sometimes you played a barn, or you played a church or whatever. In the 70s, the black acts, did what I call the festival model, which is sort of like Lollapalooza. So you had 7, anywhere from 5 to 10 acts that would show up at a venue and do an all day concert. And now they were playing NFL stadiums oftentimes when they did this, but you're split at 5 to 10 ways. Most bands in the black acts in the 70s could not go out on their own. I mean, Led Zeppelin, would go out on their own. Aerosmith later in the 70s. Kiss, I don't know if Kiss had opening acts. Nobody really wanted to open for Kiss. Or, Kiss was not an opening act very long. Because after their first or second album, they had the pyrotechnics, and nobody really wanted to mess around with Prince or Kiss, in the early 70s. So there was a big money difference, between what the classic rock acts could make on the road and what the funk and soul acts of the 70s can make on the road. So yeah, I mean, I can't blame these classic rock acts. They made a lot of money, they probably, and again, they kept all that money unless they owed the record company, money. But by the 90s, it starts changing, I forget, Ticketmaster takes over, and Ticketmaster's kind of morphed into Live Nation. In the 90s, it was still, Ticketmaster was criticized for the price of the tickets and keeping, and the acts weren't getting much money. Now it's just totally incestuous. So, Live Nation, it's almost like, going back to the late 1800s and early capitalism, you worked for, whatever, Carnegie or, the robber barons, and they provided housing, you paid rent, again, owned by your employer. You bought food, your employer owned the grocery store, they owned, you paid for the water bill and electricity bill, and oh, by the way, the power plant, the water was owned by, the factory you worked at. So, and this is what's happened at Live Nation. So, the buses, the parking facility that people park in owned by Live Nation, and so it's and then most of the touring acts, they yeah, they get paid, but then when they pay the vendors or these ancillary things associated with the venues, a lot of that's owned by Live Nation. So it's like literally Live Nation is the acts are passed through for Live Nation when it comes to the ancillary services around concert venues that bands need. So it's definitely changed, and obviously bands are no longer keeping their money. I mean, yes, they when you sign a record deal, you get a you know, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4 million advance, but that's all paid back. Unlike the book industry, the advances in the book industry aren't as nowhere close to being as big as they are in the music industry, but you don't have to pay it back. So I mean, you see, oh, so and so signed a record deal and they got this big advance. Well, that money's paid back, and the record companies are notorious for nickel and diming you for everything. They'll charge you for the bottled water. They charge you for everything. That nothing, no stone goes unturned when it comes to recouping their money. Uh, you know, and even to this day, for these classic rock acts, live albums are still big business for them. Rush, I mean, Rush must have five, six, seven live albums. Now, Pink Floyd has, they're 10 to 15. And the Rolling Stones are slowly, putting out, they're now putting out live albums where it's a live version of a studio album, and they're slowly but surely doing that for all of their classic albums, and so it's still big business, and the the classic rock fan base love these live albums, and rightfully so, because many of these acts were very good live on stage. Now, one of the more interesting aspects of these live albums is how much is it live and what happens in the studio. You can go Google Kiss Alive and Kiss Alive 2, and you know how much overdubbing was done, and turns out quite a bit was done, but it's not just those acts, and it's always interesting. I always wonder now, mixing and all that. Prince, post sign of the times, he canceled his U.S. tour for a variety of reasons. There was terrorist incidents in Europe, and he wanted to do Europe, so he did a concert movie in place of touring that year for again a variety of reasons. And he didn't like the recording that he did for the album, so he went back to Minneapolis and used his Paisley Park for and re-recorded a lot of it, but also did a lot of studio recording. So it's interesting, you know, you know, what's the difference between that release version that you get on now streaming services, but back in the day on vinyl or CD, and what actually happened in concert. Purple Rain live at Syracuse, never released as an album, but I did have the cassette and loved it when it was first released, and took it, well, VHS, not cassette, but took my VH version and put it on, put it to cassette, so I didn't have to. It could be more portable, and so they when they released, I can't, yeah, I think it was not 2018, 2019, when they remastered Purple Rain, and they did a new version, a new release. Uh, of the Syracuse concert at that time, but they just boosted the volume, and then they did a real remaster, I think in 2020, 2021, 2022 of the Syracuse, and they actually went in and did a lot of different things and mixed it differently. So it's interesting, you know, you know, you hear the stories about how much a live album was changed in the studio. Now it's interesting, it's hard to find, Prince's mix of the Syracuse concert. It's not readily online anymore, but it's in, I'd love to. I have my copy, but I'd love to. It's interesting, you know, hearing Prince's version of the Syracuse concert, this new version of the Syracuse concert, and then, there's an untreated Purple Rain live concert out of Atlanta, and it's interesting, to use that as a base to see how much mixing and different things they did, for these two versions of the Syracuse concert. So yeah, these live albums keep coming. Last I seen there were 10 or 12, well, 10 to 15 Hendrix live albums. And when he was alive, it was just the Band of Gypsies. I believe sometime in the early 2000s, Elektra released most of the live stuff from the Doors. I mean, there's I know there's a box set out there, and it's actually on at least on Spotify. I assume the other, but there's at least 20, 30, 40, 50 Doors concerts, and they didn't do big tours in the 60s, so that was a whole tour. I don't know how many live shows the Doors played total, but it's probably not over 120 to 150. Of course, nowadays, I mean, Taylor Swift will do 100 to 150 cities on a tour. So it's interesting how it's changed, but the king and the big money maker and live albums has always been classic rock. And that, look, there's been plenty of good live albums put out by other acts, but for a variety of reasons, mainly being the financial incentive, you know the you know the classic rock acts were pushed more because of the potential to make money. So anyway, yeah, haven't done a classic rock podcast in a minute. Had to do one. Enjoyed doing this episode, and obviously more classic rocks coming down the road. So anyway, thank you for coming through. Got 6 albums of my own. I record under the name Peter Exodus, Exodus, Exodus. I also write science fiction, fantasy. Got 2 novels, novella, and I write under the name Peter Exodus O'Coffer. So check my stuff out. I'm in all the streaming services. My music is attached to this YouTube channel, and I would appreciate your support. So thank you again for coming through, and I will see you next episode.